Welcome Dr. Antonio Saravia.
Thank you very much. Can you hear me well? Yes. Hello, everybody. Thank you so much for inviting me. It's a pleasure to be in Fargo. It's my first time in Fargo, and it's excellent weather. So I'm going to spread the word around that it's always beautiful in Fargo, to my friends in Georgia and so on. So I am delighted to be here. So this is a presentation that I put together to talk about economic freedom in general and economic freedom in Latin America in particular. Just because I think that economic freedom is the most important element explaining development throughout the world. When you start looking at the experiences of different countries across continents and over time, you will always see that when we have institutions of economic freedom in place, typically things tend to go well. When we don't have them, the consequence is poverty, abject poverty, right? So this is something that I dedicated a lot of my career to try to explain the effects of economic freedom. And then the next question, of course, is what determines economic freedom, right? So if economic freedom generates such positive results, how come some countries decide to go the other direction, right? Not implement economic freedom. So let me try to convince you first that economic freedom matters. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to define it so we all know what we're talking about. What is economic freedom? I'm going to use a very simple definition. Everybody would understand this. The fundamental right of every person to control his or her own actions and property, so long as he or she does not infringe another person's identical right. That's it. That's the idea. It's very simple. Essentially, what this says is you can do whatever you want with your own body, with your own actions, as long as you don't bother anybody else. That's it, right? Now, this is going to have important consequences, though. A simple definition that have important consequences. The Economic Freedom of the World Index, I'm going to be talking about, a lot about those indices today. So these are efforts to measure the degree of economic freedom implemented throughout different countries, right? And there are two of these indices available. There is the Economic Freedom of the World Index that is put together by the Fraser Institute. And then there is the Index of Economic Freedom that is put together by the Heritage Foundation in Washington, D.C. So you can go through those documents to see the data, and you will find definitions of economic freedom there. So this is what the Fraser Institute's index, or the way they define economic freedom. Put another way, economically free individuals are permitted to decide for themselves rather than having options imposed on them by the political process or by the use of violence, theft, or fraud by others. So it's, a mirror of my original definition. You can do whatever you want with your property and with your own body, your own actions, so long as you don't bother anybody else. That's it. Now, I'm going to convince you that this matters tremendously, right? And I think it matters for two reasons. It matters from a moral perspective. So you have the Declaration of Independence there, right? So life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. It would be very difficult to pursue happiness without having control over your own actions and your own property, right? If you cannot control what you do, who you work for, or what kind of profession you decide to follow, it will be very difficult to be happy. If you cannot control your property, the fruits of your labor, how can you be happy? And if we consider the pursuit of happiness a moral endeavor, then economic freedom matters from a moral perspective. I don't think that this would be controversial, right? The other reason why economic freedom matters is because it actually matters from a development or utilitarian perspective. So a lot of this talk is going to be about convincing you of that fact, that economic freedom generates positive results when it comes to development. So I'm going to use the Economic Freedom of the World Index. This is the one that the Fraser Institute puts together. The Economic Freedom of the World Index is divided in 5 different areas. So it's an effort to measure economic freedom across 5 different categories. The first one is the size of government. So the idea here is that if the government is too big, right, it will have tremendous influence over your actions and your property. If the government is too big, it first means that it needs to get financed, and that means that they're going to typically collect a lot of taxes from you. That is going to affect your property, and that is going to affect your ability to do what you want with your own actions. If you have a big government, they are typically going to impose policies like, we're going to dedicate ourselves to the production of natural gas, or we're going to do this, or we're going to do that. And by doing that, by influencing the economy, they restrict what you can do with your property and with your actions. So the bigger the government, the less economic freedom we have. So that's the first category that we're going to try to measure in this index, the size of government. The second one is the legal system and property rights. So this is something that I talked about during my research presentation yesterday, the rule of law, right? So if the rule of law is not respected, if every time you have to do something, you have to bribe an official, right? If every time you want to register your business, you have to go through 200 different bureaucratic steps to be able to do that, right? Then the legal system is not protecting your private property, and therefore you don't have economic freedom. So this is something that when you talk about it here in the United States, people look at you and say, yeah, of course, that's obvious. Right? The legal system is designed to help you. Yes, because we live in the United States. But in most other countries around the world, the legal system is actually designed to bother you, to put barriers and block your private activity, right? And you feel this as soon as you land in another country. This happened to me. I'm not going to mention the country, but I flew into this country, just got to the airport. This is a true story. I'm at the airport. I'm trying to go through immigration to show my passport and stuff, and I see that there is a line that goes kind of faster than my line. Just people going, and I'm here standing for 10 minutes, 15 minutes, and my line is not moving. So I decide to step to the other one, to try to go faster. And when I get there, the guy, I present my passport, and the guy does this on the desk. What does that mean? And everybody in that line knows that means that you have to put $50 there. So if you have the $50, you put, and then you go through. So as soon as you land at the airport in other countries, you feel that the legal system is not respected, and therefore you don't have economic freedom. The other area is sound money. Sound money means that these countries are not affected by inflation, or in some cases hyperinflation. Okay? If the money doesn't protect the value of your property, then you don't have control over that property. So what I'm trying to say, for example, is suppose that you get paid after, you get your check, your salary check after the month, but by the time you start using this money, prices have doubled or prices have tripled. So when you go and try to spend this money, you actually have lost value. You cannot buy the same number of goods and services. Therefore, your property has vanished in your pocket, has melted away. So if we don't have sound money, there is no way to protect the value, the fruits of your labor. So this is another area that we need to measure then. So that's the third one in the Economic Freedom of the World Index. Many of the countries in South America, I'm going to show you this today, went through periods in which they didn't have sound money. The government was printing currency paper, and as a result, prices were going up everywhere, and therefore people could not protect their property. Fourth area, freedom to trade internationally. Are we allowed to engage in international trade with other countries? Can we freely sell our products to other countries, or will the government tell us that we cannot do it, or if we do it, we have to pay an extra tax? Can we import things freely from other countries? Or is the government going to tell us that every time we bring a foreign product into our country, we're going to have to pay high tariffs, right? This is something actually that the United States got hurt when President Trump was in the office, because he likes tariffs. He likes to impose taxes on imported goods. Gonna get political, you always can find good things that a president did, bad things that a president did, etc. He reduced corporate taxes from 35% to 21%, and that was an important incentive for many companies to come to the United States. So you can say, okay, that's good. But the other thing that he did is that he raised tariffs, especially on Chinese products. And so that restricts our economic freedom. If we want to buy Chinese products, here comes the government that tells us that every time we do that, we have to pay this extra tax. So freedom to trade internationally is going to have to measure. It captures an important element of economic freedom. And finally, regulation, right? If the government is involved in the way businesses do their business, you can sell here, but you cannot sell there. Or if you're going to do this, you have to pay a minimum wage. If you're going to hire somebody, make sure that you do this or that. So regulation can be problematic. Over-regulation restricts our economic freedom. So those are the 5 areas that are used to measure economic freedom around the world. So what the Fraser Institute does then is it puts together all of this data, gets the average of these 5 categories, and gives you a summary index for the country. And it's a number between 0 and 10. The higher the number, the more economic freedom you have. The lower the number, the less economic freedom you have. And the Fraser Institute does this for, I think, something like 180 countries around the world. So this is what you get. I don't know if you can see that, but this is the ranking put together by the Fraser Institute. The first countries there, I don't know if I have this thing. The first countries on the list are Singapore and Hong Kong. And this has been consistent throughout the years. If you review this index, even back in the early 2000s or even the 1990s, you will find that Singapore and Hong Kong are consistently numbers 1 and 2 in the index. Anybody been to Singapore? Anybody been to Hong Kong? Oh, you gotta go. You gotta go. I've been to those 2 countries. It's just amazing. What you see is you can feel freedom, right? There are no tariffs at all. It's open borders. You can trade with any country you want. Governments don't control any prices. There are no quotas for anything. And so it's very easy to navigate and do whatever you need to do. So long, of course, as long as you don't bother anybody else, right? So Singapore and Hong Kong, then we have Switzerland, New Zealand. The United States is number 5 for this year. This is the 2021. This is the latest available. The United States is number 5. Then you have Ireland, Denmark, Australia, the United Kingdom, Canada in number 10, Taiwan number 11. Now, as I mentioned those countries, and when you graduate, if you want to have an international experience and you say, well, I would like to travel and work abroad for a little bit, wouldn't these countries sound nice, like countries that you would like to live in? Yeah, I would like to go to Switzerland or New Zealand. Yeah, I mean, it sounds like nice, good places where I can work, probably make some good money, and then return to the US. But as I start going down the list, you're not going to feel as excited. So, for example, if I go down and I start looking at the repressed countries in red, right? So what do we have there? We have the Democratic Republic of Congo. We have, what is that? Lithuania, Algeria. Unfortunately, this is very sad. Argentina is number 145, I think. Well, I can read it from here probably better. So Argentina is 158 in the ranking. Then we have Libya, Iran, beautiful country, Iran. I went skiing in Iran one time, but they are highly repressed. Then you have Yemen, Sudan, Syria, Zimbabwe, and guess who takes the honors as the country with the lowest level of economic freedom? Any guesses? Huh? Well, North Korea would do it, but we don't have data, so they are not in the ranking. Cuba is not in the ranking either. So, Venezuela, right? Venezuela takes the honors as the country with the lowest level of economic freedom. Now, as I read those countries, would you like to go there and work for a little while? Yeah, I want to work in Yemen, right? Yeah, probably not. I am from Bolivia myself, from South America. Bolivia is number 117 in this list, is in yellow. Not as bad as in red, but in yellow. What this shows you is that economic freedom actually matters from a development or utilitarian perspective, right? More economic freedom, more chances to develop and lift more people out of poverty. Take a look at this, right? So this is GDP per capita throughout the different quartiles of the economic freedom index. So what this shows is that GDP per capita in the most free countries in blue is 8 times higher than the GDP per capita in the least free countries in red. Right. So it does matter from an economic, from a development perspective. This is an interesting graph. So this is the share of the economic pie that the poorest 10% gets in each one of these countries. So I'm going to repeat that. It's the share of the economic pie that the poorest 10% are grabbing. So what you see there, it's actually something that may surprise you. So it doesn't matter, right? Economic freedom doesn't matter here because it seems like in most countries, the poorest 10% grab about 2 to 3% of the economic pie, right? And so you may be thinking, okay, so what good does economic freedom do for the poor countries? But what are we not seeing here? So this is the share of the economic pie that the poorest 10% get. But what is the size of the economic pie in these different countries, right? So in the blue countries, the economic pie is much bigger. So 3% is a lot more money. So when you look this in absolute terms, what you get is that the poorest 10% actually get about $14,000 of income, annual income, in the most free countries compared to less than 2,000 in the least free countries. So the lesson here is, if you're going to be poor, you want to be poor in a country that is free, right? Because you get like 13 times more income there, right? This is life expectancy. So as you can see, if you live in a free country, you tend to live longer, 15 years more than in a repressed country in red. This is amazing. I mean, we're talking about 15 more years, right? So this is tremendous. Look at infant mortality rate. How much bigger it is in repressed countries than it is in free countries. Poverty rates, right? So this is amazing. If we go by the standard definition, which is $2, about $2 a day, that's the World Bank's definition of extreme poverty, you'll see that 30.8% are considered extremely poor in repressed countries versus less than 1% in free countries, right? So economic freedom does matter from a development perspective. Social progress, this is an index that combines different measures of social programs. So you have literacy there, you have infant mortality again, and other, access to clean water and so on and so forth. So as you can see, in freer countries, you have a much higher index of social progress. One more, yeah, because I like this one, because people always say, right, you economists, you always talk about GDP and GDP per capita and income and all this money. What about happiness? Maybe, right? In a quote-unquote repressed country, people are happier. What about that, right? Turns out that they are not happy. So this is the UN World Happiness Index, and as you can see, freer countries, you are happier than in least free countries, right? So you're not going to convince me that people are happy in, I don't know, in Venezuela. Although, I'm going to show you something interesting here. So this is something that I put together for one of my papers. This is GDP per capita in 2015 in the vertical axis and the economic freedom of the world summary index in the horizontal axis. And as you can see, there is a positive correlation. It seems to that when you run the regression, you're going to have a positive slope. This is something that I put together with happiness on the vertical axis and the economic freedom index in the horizontal axis. And again, the cloud of observations clearly indicates a positive slope. But this is something interesting. If you look at these outliers, right? Argentina, and the other country right there is Algeria. So this is interesting because Argentina has a happiness level compared to Singapore, all the way there. And yet they have a much lower level of economic freedom. So how can they be so happy? I mean, yes, they have very good soccer, right? So maybe that's what explains. They can go to the stadium and be happy that way. I don't know. They were world champions, right? The last World Cup, Argentina won it. I don't know. So there is something there. And then you start looking at this cloud of observations. And actually what you see is that the kind of outliers there are from Latin America. You see Brazil, Ecuador, Colombia, Mexico, Argentina. So kind of countries with high levels of happiness, but low levels of economic freedom. So this is an interesting sociological phenomenon. I'm from Latin America. I don't know, as long as you have salsa dancing on Friday nights and soccer on Sundays, maybe you're okay. Maybe you're happy. But in general, the higher the level of economic freedom, the higher the level of happiness. Another interesting aspect of this is from another one of my papers on migration. What you actually see is that the higher the level of economic freedom, the lower the percentage of people that voice a willingness to migrate. So they want to stay in their country. So for example, Chile, very high levels of economic freedom. Notice that I switched to the other index here. This is the index of economic freedom put together by the Heritage Foundation. So instead of going from 0 to 10, now I go from 0 to 100, but they measured the kind of the same thing. So Chile, with high levels of economic freedom, they don't have a lot of migrants that decide to leave Chile, right? But what about Venezuela, right? So very low levels of economic freedom, and everybody wants to get out of Venezuela. I mean, the situation is so bad that we have Venezuelan migrants in Bolivia. Just, yeah, I mean, that should tell you how bad things are, right? So even if we take away that outlier, if you say, well, that's an outlier, remove Venezuela from there, you will still get a negative correlation. So economic freedom matters because it makes people less willing to leave their countries. And then, of course, this is the famous picture of the Korean Peninsula. This shows clearly that economic freedom matters. This peninsula used to be just one country, North Korea and South Korea. So we're talking about the same people, same culture, same language, At some point, they were the same country. And then got a civil war. The guys in the north decided to go the communist route. The guys in the south decided to go the capitalist route with economic freedom. Fast forward, and this is what you get, right? So this is a satellite image taken at night. You see a lot of lights in South Korea, development, things happening. Nothing is happening in North Korea. There's one light only in Pyongyang, that's the capital, where a good friend Kim Jong-un lives, but that's it, right? So anyway, hopefully I've convinced you that economic freedom matters. So what I want to do now is to talk specifically about Latin America. And in fact, I should change probably the title here and say South America, because I'm going to concentrate on these countries. So I'm not going to have Central America here, the small countries of Guatemala, Costa Rica, El Salvador, and so on, and I'm not going to have Mexico. So just South America, but this should give you a pretty good idea of what's going on. So this is the average economic freedom of the world index for these 9 countries in South America. So it's something very interesting. 1970, 75, 80, very low, right? From 0, remember this goes from 0 to 10. So we are at about 4.5 and so on, but something very interesting happens around 1985, and this thing jumps all the way up. Well, when I say all the way up, it goes to 6.5. It's still not very good, but it's a significant structural break. So what in the world happened in 1985 that raised the levels of economic freedom in Latin America? What happened in 1985 and throughout the late 80s, 90s was called the Washington Consensus. Okay. What is the Washington Consensus? At some point, these countries in Latin America, coming from the 70s, so to tell you the whole story, right, in the 50s and 60s, there was this ideological push for import substitution. So the idea was that you have to produce your own capital goods or manufactured goods instead of importing them from the developed countries. Some people down there, some economists, got this crazy idea that if Latin America would produce their own refrigerators, their own cars, their own heavy machines, then they wouldn't have to import these things from, say, the United States or from Europe, and they would not spend that money that way, and they would be able to develop. So there was this whole push for import substitution. We no longer want to be banana republics, right, that export only natural resources. We want to produce our own manufactured goods and substitute our imports. Well, that was a disaster, of course. How do you compete, say, with Japan in terms of cars? You have no idea how to produce cars. They have developed economies of scale for years and years and years. Wouldn't it be better to import the cheap Japanese cars and you focus on your comparative advantage? That's what we know now. But back in the 50s and 60s, where there was this push for import substitution. So it was a disaster. The result was that the 80s were called the lost decade in Latin America because most countries entered a huge economic crisis as a result of this ideological push for import substitution that never worked. So they are in the middle of this crisis, and the presidents, the secretaries of the economy, the minister of economics get together and say, we need to do something. What do we do? And so they elaborate a list of 10 policies that these countries can adopt. They travel to Washington, they get together with people from the World Bank, the IMF, and so on, and they say, well, this is what we need to do. And so that's why it was called the Washington Consensus. And that's the list. And this is what most countries in Latin America decided to do in the late 80s to solve the crisis. When you start reading through this list, you realize that essentially what they're saying is we need to move towards economic freedom. Reduce national budget deficits. That reduces the size of government, the first category. Redirect spending from politically popular areas towards neglected fields with high economic returns. Reform the tax system, which essentially meant reduce taxes to give more incentives to private companies. Liberalize the financial sector with the goal of market-determined interest rates. Adopt a competitive single exchange rate. That meant sound money, so we don't have these devaluations going on in the black market. Reduce trade restrictions, freedom to trade internationally. Abolish barriers to foreign direct investment. Privatize state-owned enterprise. Right, so that's a direct move towards economic freedom. Abolish policies that restrict competition. Provide secure, affordable property rights. So this is what they decided to do. John Williamson was an economist at the time that coined the term the Washington Consensus. Later on, he actually regretted calling it the Washington Consensus because he thought if people go on calling it the Washington Consensus, it sounds like this was policies directed from the World Bank, from the United States, from the IMF. And in reality, he says, what happened was that the Latin American countries themselves, they came to Washington with this list. So what they did is they asked the World Bank and the IMF for economic support to implement these policies, but they came up with the policies. So maybe we shouldn't be calling it the Washington Consensus, maybe the Latin American Consensus, but it's a move towards economic freedom, and that explains that jump. There are a couple of papers that I'm going to cite here that have studied the effects of the Washington Consensus of these policies, and they show indeed that there is a positive effect in terms of some development indicators. This paper in particular, good friend Kevin Greer and his wife, what they did was they looked at the countries that adopted the Washington Consensus throughout the world, because this list became not only a Latin American list, then it became something also for Africa and Southeast Asia. They studied about 49 countries that adopted the Washington Consensus, and they showed that those countries showed 2.07 to 2.87 percentage points higher economic growth than the countries that did not adopt the Washington Consensus, right? So it seems that it matters. Okay, so let's fast forward now. We have the 70s, the 80s is the lost decade, the Washington Consensus, everybody goes through for economic freedom, but this is what's happening between 2000 and 2021. So the line on top, the red one, is the world, so it's the average for the world, and the blue one is Latin America, right? So what this shows is that even though there was an important move towards economic freedom in the 90s, after that, they didn't really follow up on this and kept improving. They kind of remained stagnated between 6.2 and 6.6, where the rest of the world was actually moving more towards economic freedom. So this is disappointing, because Latin America is a great continent, a lot of natural resources, closer relatively to the United States, so there is trade that they can do with the United States and Mexico, big countries, but unfortunately they didn't take advantage and they kind of remained stagnated. So what I want to do now is to show you the 5 different areas that make the Economic Freedom of the World Summary Index, and try to show which ones are contributing and which ones are hurting Latin America, right? So that's the index that I showed you before, when the Washington Consensus in the 90s, they get to about 6.5, but then they kind of remain stagnated there. So what's going on in terms of the 5 different areas? So what's going on is that the one that is helping the most is actually area 3, which is sound money. So what this shows is that one lesson, at least, that Latin America learned is that we can no longer have these hyperinflations going on everywhere, because that's really going to hurt us. So that seems to be a lesson well learned, and most countries have not gone back to just printing currency out of thin air, and this has helped. There are, of course, 2 exceptions in current times, and those are Argentina and Venezuela, right? But other than that, most of the countries have learned that lesson, and that's why that area is much higher than the average for Latin America. The other area that seems to help is area 4, which is freedom to trade internationally. So it seems that most countries have reduced their tariffs, and they actually promote export. If you talk to most politicians, it doesn't matter if they're politicians from the left or the right in Latin America, most politicians will agree that freedom to trade internationally is a good thing. So that is reflected there. The other one that seems to help is area 1, the size of government. So they have not allowed their governments to grow too big. But the areas that hurt Latin America are regulation and, very importantly, the legal system and property rights. So this is the huge problem with Latin America. It's very difficult to do business because there is no protection of private property. The legal system doesn't work. There is bribing everywhere. There is bureaucracy everywhere. You know how many days it takes for a company to get a construction permit in Peru? Just a construction permit to do some development? I don't even know in days, but it's about 3 years. Yeah. You know how long it takes to open up a business in Dubai? 3 hours. So, you tell me, right? So this is the basic problem of Latin America. I'm going to show you now something that I put together just for you guys. This is, I don't know if you like Gapminder. I'm obsessed with this thing. I try to show my data as much as I can using this. But this is going to be the economic freedom of the world summary index for each one of these countries over time. Okay, so let me play this for you. So we're starting in 1974-75. So you're going to see that it's pretty low, right? Venezuela is high on top. So Venezuela has high levels of economic freedom. This is the 90s, the lost decade. Remember, the Washington Consensus is starting in 1985. Right there, the Washington Consensus starts going up, right? Most countries adopt economic freedom. Look at Bolivia up there. It's the number 3, number 4 now. Chile, Uruguay, they take the lesson very seriously. Venezuela is down, but even Venezuela is going to do a little bit of economic freedom. Now remember, President Chavez in Venezuela comes to power in 2000. Take a look at what happens in 2000, right? Chavez, Chavismo, socialism. Chile is doing well, but look at Argentina, look at Venezuela. They are going to start slowing down. Bolivia is now down there. And this is what happens through the 2000s. Venezuela is a disaster. Chile continues to do well. Peru, Uruguay, Argentina is a disaster as well. So what this shows you, right, is that some countries are serious about this. They take the lessons of the Washington Consensus seriously, exceptionally Chile after 1973. What happened in Chile in 1973?
Pablo Neruda was killed.
Huh?
Pablo Neruda was killed.
In 1973? Salvador Allende was the president then. Yeah. So what happened was that... Right. What happened in 1973 was a very violent coup d'etat by Augusto Pinochet, a military that decided to take power. Salvador Allende was the president, as a socialist president. He committed suicide inside the palace the day the coup d'etat was happening. And it was violent and terrible, and of course we condemn that. But this new president, Pinochet, decided to embrace economic freedom. And he called up new and young economists that had studied in the University of Chicago under Milton Friedman. And these were called the Chicago Boys. And all of these Chileans, young economists, came back to the country and implemented policies of economic freedom. And so after 1973, Chile never looked back and just embraced economic freedom. And it's probably the most developed country in Latin America. So let me go back here now. The other thing that I think it's important, and I'm going to try to wrap up in the next 5 minutes, it's the golden decade in Latin America. The golden decade refers to the period between about 2003, 2004 to 2014, right? So 2004 to 2014, the 7 largest economies grew at an average of 5.6%, which was much higher than the 3.7% in the early 1990s. Something very interesting was going on during these years. Not economic freedom, because as I've shown you, they kind of stagnated after the Washington Consensus. They didn't do much. But something was going on that allowed these countries to grow faster. Poverty fell from 40% in 2002 to 26% in 2011. The inequality of income also goes down. So this is why this is called the golden decade. So what was going on between 2004 and 2014? This is what was going on. The price of oil was going up. If you look at 2000, right there, this is the WTI price of oil, price of a barrel. 2004, take a look at what happens. It goes up, and it goes up, and it goes up. There is a sharp decline in 2010, but then it keeps going up and up and up. Take a look at the difference between 2004 and 2014. You see that massive increase? It's huge. And why does this matter? because Venezuela exports what? Oil. Bolivia exports natural gas. But when you export natural gas, the price at which you sell your gas is attached or indexed with the price of oil. So the price of oil goes up, the exports of natural gas go up. So this was happening, and this is huge, this is massive. Just to give you an idea, Bolivia exporting natural gas, between 2006 and 2014, Bolivia sold about 60 billion worth of dollars worth of natural gas. To give you perspective, 60 billion is 3 times Bolivia's GDP in 2006. So between 2006 and 2014, somebody came and said, here, you have 3 countries. See what you do with that, right? So this is massive, but this was not only happening with oil. This was also happening with silver. Take a look at this. From 2004 to 2014, you see the boom in natural resources? So oil, silver, soybean, take a look, 2004 to 2014. It's massive. Copper, gold. So Latin America is a continent that exports natural resources. So when you have all of this going on at the same time, what do you expect? That's a golden decade, right? So I'm going to show you here another one of these lovely gapminder things. I'm sure you're going to appreciate. So I'm going to start this in 1978. Okay, this is GDP per capita for each one of the Latin American countries. I have the same countries that I've been showing you, and I added Guyana here because I think you need to see Guyana. Guyana is a tiny little country in the very north part of South America. So I'm going to pick this up in 1978. What the numbers that you see are GDP per capita. Okay, so here we go. So this is running, right? So Venezuela is the wealthiest country in Latin America. Uruguay is right there, number 2. Chile, remember after 1973, what happened to Chile? Oh, Suriname is also there. But I'm just going to let you see this and see the tragedy that Venezuela represents, right? So Venezuela is leading in terms of GDP per capita. Argentina, somebody would say Argentina is a European country for all purposes, but I'm going to let you see what happens to these countries as we go into the 2000s. Right, so now we're in the middle of the Washington Consensus. It's the mid-90s, and Argentina keeps leading the way. Uruguay is a very small country, small population. But Chile is doing well, Brazil is a huge country, Venezuela right there. Bolivia is a disaster. Has always been. So Bolivia is second to last, right? Now it's the last country in terms of GDP per capita. Chile, the most developed country in Latin America. Venezuela is still doing well. This is 2006, right? Why? Why is Venezuela doing so well? Because of all of the oil, right? They are selling oil like crazy. But take a look at that. See? 2012. Now start paying attention to Guyana. Very poor country, but you're going to see what happens. And see what happened to Venezuela? Bolivia is about to beat Venezuela at this point. It's 2018 and Bolivia beats Venezuela. Right? Take a look at Guyana. Uruguay, Chile keep doing well. Take a look at Guyana. Yeah? That's 2023. So, why is Guyana doing so well with a GDP per capita of about $20,000? Oil, right? So the lessons here are Uruguay embracing economic freedom, Chile embracing economic freedom, they are doing well. Oil matters, but the lesson is, if you go the other way, right? So if you go the other way in terms of economic freedom, like Venezuela, it's going to be a disaster. So I'm going to wrap up here by showing you the tragedy that Bolivia is. So this is the index of economic freedom from 1995 to 2018. So as you can see, Bolivia is going in the other direction. But take a look at GDP per capita. GDP per capita is actually growing. How do you explain this? And in fact, if you look at GDP growth, GDP growth is also growing, even though your index of economic freedom keeps going down. And so one would say, well, you see, economic freedom doesn't matter, especially if you don't like these ideas, if you favor big government, you say economic freedom doesn't matter. But let me show you, in fact, take a look at this. Economic freedom and poverty. So as economic freedom goes down, poverty goes down. It's just like, economic freedom doesn't matter, we can reduce poverty, even being a big government, kind of a socialist economy. Well, what happened was, this is again the one with economic growth. What happens, of course, was if you put the oil prices in there, that is what explains the massive increase in economic growth and GDP per capita. So that doesn't mean that economic freedom doesn't matter. Here is the average growth rate between 2006 and 2014 for all of these countries. Peru growing really fast, Uruguay, Paraguay, Colombia, Bolivia, Argentina, and Venezuela at the bottom. So when you start looking at this and compare that with their economic freedom in 2005, so the way they start this decade, there is a little bit of a correlation, isn't it? So Peru and Uruguay and Paraguay with higher levels of economic freedom in 2005, that allows them to take advantage of that golden decade. Venezuela, a very low level of economic freedom in 2005. So there is a positive correlation between the economic freedom index in 2005 and your growth during that golden decade. So economic freedom does matter. And when you look at the different areas, it turns out that the ones that show a significant correlation are Area 3 and Area 4 again. So Area 3 is sound money, Area 4 is freedom to trade internationally. So there is a positive correlation with those areas. Let me stop right here. There's probably a lot more we can say, but I think this is a good place to stop. So much. So, if you have any questions, yes, please.
Could you comment on dollarization, for example, in Ecuador, and how that affects decisions at the government level and their economic?
Yeah, so the question is about dollarization as a policy in Ecuador, and now they are thinking about it in Argentina. I love it. I wish most countries would go that route. Why? Because when you dollarize, you essentially close the central bank. And that means that you are not subject to central bank policies or politicians coming in and saying, oh, we need to help out with the economy, so we're going to print a little bit more money here, a little bit more money there. We're going to do monetary policy in order to fine-tune the economy. And whenever we have economies fine-tuning the economy, the classic result is just disaster, right? Because you get addicted to just printing money, and then all of a sudden you start seeing inflation going up. So I wish more countries will consider it. I know that dollarizing means that now your central bank is the Federal Reserve, and then we can argue if the Federal Reserve behaves or doesn't, right? But I would certainly argue that the Federal Reserve behaves better than most central banks in Latin America. When I talk about this, a lot of people say, but no, wait a second, Switzerland and Sweden, they have their own central banks and blah, blah, blah. And why do you have to? Well, okay, if we are Sweden, fine. But we're not, right? We are countries that our legal system and property rights are very low, where politicians tend to have a lot of influence. So therefore, we want to remove that. When Ecuador did it, they saw a spike in terms of businesses and investment, foreign investment and so on, and it became really popular because nobody wants money that doesn't have value. If you go and run a referendum right now in Ecuador and you ask people, do you want to go back to the sucre, which was the local currency, nobody would say, yes, let me go back to the sucre. Everybody likes to have the dollar as the currency. And they are thinking about doing that in Argentina. I think the new president said that they were thinking about mid-2025 for them to be able to dollarize, and so they're going in that direction. Yeah. Yes?
Well, just as you brought up, what are your thoughts on the new president of Argentina?
Yeah. So the question is about the new president of Argentina, Javier Milei. Javier Milei is the first libertarian president in the world. The first libertarian president that openly says what we need to do is to minimize the effect or the role of the government in the economy. We need to protect property rights. We need to open borders to international trade and so on. He's the first president that wins an election under that platform. Most politicians will say, yes, the market economy is good, but the government will have to do this and that. And, this guy went all in and he won the election. Of course, it was because Argentina was submerged in a huge crisis that came out of decades of socialism, Kirchnerism in Argentina. And of course, people were fed up and they chose this guy. So I am very hopeful that he's going to do well. He already lowered the budget deficit to zero. So they had a huge budget deficit, and in less than 1 year, he put it down to zero. So that meant that he had to cut a lot of expenses. He's thinking about dollarizing in 2025. He removed a lot of price controls in the economy. For example, just to give you an idea, rent, when you rent an apartment, that the rent was controlled by the government, to suppress the price, which meant that there were not apartments available and there were a lot of homeless people. Right? Because if you impose a rent control, quantity supply, it goes down, right? So the landlords don't want to offer their apartments for rent. And so he lifted this and he solved the problem of, a lot of the problem of homelessness in just a very short period of time. So I think he's doing well. A lot of people don't like him because he's very aggressive. When he gives interviews, he curses, and he's, he has a flamboyant personality, but I think he has the right ideas. Yes, please.
Just a couple of quick observations and questions. So I wouldn't necessarily qualify import substitution as nonsensical because in 1960s that was, even though not necessarily Latin America, but globally, time of post-colonial era starting. So most of those countries were looking for the ways to actually exist as a sovereign nations, and they couldn't necessarily jump immediately into being dependent on foreign masters in every possible way in economic terms because their masters had the technology, know-how, and so on. So, there was an idea that Prebisch, the Argentinians, and so on, for the UNCTAD, United Nations, were promoting the import substitution and so on. But, then was it really necessary to emphasize in economic terms, advantages of what we are talking about, which I agree with as an economist, by demoting in most violent ways, like the democratically elected governments like in Chile. And yes, and then there was socialist, but he was democratically elected.
Sure. Yep.
And the Colo-Colo Stadium, for decades had the ghosts of people murdered there.
Yep.
That's what probably most people don't necessarily follow here. So just saying that the University of Chicago boys came in with their economic agenda, was it necessary to have Pinochet for 20 years and military junta managing the country to have the necessary infrastructure that really went against the people of Chile's rule? So on. And similar things happen in Argentina and Brazil and so on. And one very final thing on Jeffrey Sachs, who was the main person implementing, even in Bolivia and elsewhere, through the International Monetary Fund, the Washington Consensus. Why is he changing his mind these days? Because he was the key proponent, to do all of that in Latin America. I mean, he was the person, the point man, center. Same in Poland and wherever he went, we all know what happened. So a lot of things.
No, it's perfectly fine, and thank you so much, because it seems that you know a lot of the history in Latin America. I'm going to correct you, though, on one thing, the last thing that you said about Jeffrey Sachs. Jeffrey Sachs has an interview, you can catch it on YouTube, in which they ask him about the reforms in Bolivia in 1985. And he tells the story. He says, I went to this cocktail party. They invited me in Bolivia to give this advice and so on. And I started talking to this guy. His name, Gonzalo Sanchez de Lozada, former president, ousted by the current regime in Bolivia. He lives in Washington, D.C. now, he's 93. I started talking to this guy, and he tells me all the necessary reforms that Bolivia needed to embrace, which essentially was moving to economic freedom. He is the one that had the clear ideas, and I came and just subscribed that using my Harvard pedigree. So it was not Jeffrey Sachs that designed the ideas. This was designed by Bolivians. But they needed somebody like Jeffrey Sachs with the name to sell that to the people. You can catch that interview in YouTube, so it's very interesting. Did we need a Pinochet with a brutal regime for 20 years to implement this? It's the $1 million question. I wish we didn't, right? Because there was a lot of suffering, a lot of people that died. It was essentially a civil war for 20 years. I wish it would have happened under a democratic regime. I wish the coup d'etat had never happened. And Allende, even though he was a socialist, he was a democratically elected president, and he didn't have to commit suicide. But the reforms were so severe, so drastic, that the question is, could that have been implemented in democracy? And the answer is probably no, right? You needed a very strong regime to back up these ideas and implement them. My answer is always, I wish it would have happened under a democratic process. So I'm with you on that. And then the import substitution, I do think it was nonsensical in the sense that if you, well, I guess, if you knew what we now know, based on the progress of our science, right? We know that embracing comparative advantage is the way to go, not substituting something that you cannot produce with the same efficiency that other countries. And I guess your point is we always have to consider the historical context in which these policies were implemented or these ideas. Yes. But the truth is that they were not the right ideas, and they actually caused a lot of harm. So the lost decade in the 80s, it shows that these policies put the entire economy at risk because all of the resources were focused on trying to substitute something that we couldn't ever substitute. And so in the 80s, these countries were desperate to find solutions, and the Washington consensus came about. Yes, please.
Yeah, so I was wondering if you could comment on similar methods that we see in very different contexts, but with Bukele, and his approach to fighting crime, and where you see the institutional evolution going in El Salvador.
Yeah, so the question is about Bukele, President Bukele in El Salvador, with these very controversial policies to control crime. El Salvador was a country, was probably the most violent country in the world, with all of the gangs operating almost freely. There was almost zero tourism in El Salvador. Nobody would go to El Salvador. Nobody in your right mind would go to El Salvador. But he established a war on crime and the gangs and put a lot of these gang members in prison. You've probably seen the pictures. A lot of people complain and say this is abuse to human rights and so on and so forth. And I agree, it's very tough. And then you wonder, just like with Pinochet, do you need a strong president to get rid of this violence, or can this be done at a more democratic, step-by-step process that respects human rights? I don't know the answer. It's a tough question. One thing that I can tell you is that Salvadorians are very happy about what President Bukele has done, because there is safety and people can walk on the streets. Tourism is starting to come to El Salvador, and we're going to see good things happening out of this. But do I wish this was done in a more humane maybe way? Sure. But sometimes reality is really tough to navigate, right?